At my brother's grand opening. Dad raised his glass. Evan finally built something real. Then he turned to me. When will you stop moving numbers around and do the same? A few guests laughed. I sipped my water and looked at Evan. Do you want to tell him? His hand tightened around his glass. Not tonight. Nora. So I opened the folder Paige had asked me to bring and slid the lease across the table, read the landlord's name. Dad frowned at Foundry Row Properties. Then I flipped to the signature page. His face drained when he saw mine. But the lease was not the secret that truly changed the room. The reason Evan had kept my name hidden was, my name is Nora Bennett. I was 37 and lived in Louisville, Kentucky, where I owned a commercial real estate company called Foundry Row Properties, to my family. That meant I spent my days staring at spreadsheets and collecting rent. To my father, it barely counted as work. Dad had spent 40 years as a construction superintendent. He respected things he could touch: steel beams, kitchen equipment, loading docks, crews in hard hats. Evan understood that world. My brother was 3 years older and had worked in restaurants since high school. He started washing dishes, became a line cook, then a sous chef, an executive chef, and ran a food truck. He was talented. He worked hard. I was proud of him. The problem was that Dad never praised Evan without turning toward me. Your brother creates things, he would say. You move numbers around, at family dinners. Evan's long shifts were proof of ambition. My flexible schedule was proof that I did not have a serious career. Mom called whenever someone needed to pick up a cake, meet a repairman, or arrive early to set the table. Evan has a business to run, she would explain. I ran a business too. They simply had no idea what it owned. Dad still sent me articles about buying a starter home, building retirement savings, and finding a stable job with benefits. He once asked whether I planned to keep managing rentals forever. I told him I had plans. He nodded the way people do when they hear something polite instead of important. For years, I let it happen. I did not want every family gathering to become a presentation about my finances. I did not want to compete with my brother, and I had learned that correcting Dad usually led to another lecture about how much more practical Evan was, so I stopped explaining. That silence became evidence in their minds. They assumed I was behind because I never showed them the numbers. They assumed Evan was the family's only entrepreneur because his name was printed on menus and mine appeared on contracts they never saw. Even when I bought my first property, Dad treated it like an experiment. Even when I formed my company, he called it a side project. My father did not think I had failed because he knew my life. He thought I had failed because he had never been curious enough to learn it. And by the time he made that toast, Evan knew exactly what Dad was getting wrong and had his own reason for keeping quiet. 8 years earlier, I was still working as a construction project coordinator when I found a neglected duplex listed for $236,000. It needed cosmetic repairs, but the roof was sound, the neighborhood was improving, and the rent from one side could cover most of the mortgage. I needed about $42,000 for the down payment, closing costs, and initial repairs. I asked Dad to lend me $25,000, not give it to me, lend it. I brought a promissory note, an interest rate, and a repayment schedule. He barely looked at the numbers. I'm not putting retirement money into an expensive experiment. Then he called me a bad investment. I sold my newer car, worked additional project management jobs at night, and used almost every dollar I had saved. I bought the duplex without him. For 6 years, I lived in one unit and rented the other. I learned how to screen tenants, negotiate repairs, plan reserves, handle insurance claims, and recognize the difference between a property that looked cheap and one that could actually produce income. When the neighborhood changed, I sold the duplex for $412,000. After paying the loan and closing costs, I walked away with about $178,000 in equity. That became the foundation of Foundry Row Properties. I bought 2 smaller commercial spaces, improved them, stabilized the tenants, and kept reinvesting the income. Then I found the building Dad would later stand inside. It was an 8,700 square foot brick warehouse built in 1919. The roof leaked, the electrical system was outdated, the windows were boarded, the HVAC barely worked, there was no fire suppression system suitable for a restaurant. Dad drove past it with me once. That place needs a wrecking ball, he said. I bought it for $940,000. I invested $275,000 of my own equity and financed the rest with a commercial loan. The renovation cost another $325,000. We replaced the roof, upgraded the electrical service, installed fire suppression, rebuilt the HVAC, repaired masonry, restored the windows, improved accessibility, and cleaned years of debris from the rear lot. Halfway through, we discovered structural damage behind one wall. The project nearly exceeded budget. I delayed paying myself, renegotiated contractor schedules, and protected the reserve account instead of pretending the problem did not exist. More than a year later, the building finally passed inspection for restaurant, retail, and office use. Dad never asked how it went. He still thought I managed a few rentals. By then, the abandoned property he had mocked had become the largest risk I had ever taken, and I had already decided exactly what kind of tenant could make it work. I just did not expect that tenant to be my brother. 6 months after the warehouse passed inspection, Evan called me. He and Paige had spent 2 years developing Juniper and Iron, a modern southern restaurant with an open kitchen, 90 seats, and a private dining room for events. They had a business plan, a chef team, supplier relationships, and enough savings to make the concept credible. What they did not have was a building. Their broker, Celeste Ward, showed them 3 locations before bringing them to mine. Evan recognized me the moment I walked into the meeting. "You own this place. I own the company that owns it." He looked around at the restored brick, new windows, upgraded electrical panels, and ventilation shafts. "Why didn't you tell us you never asked what I was working on?" Paige tried not to smile. Even though we were family, I refused to negotiate the lease privately. Celeste compared market rents, reviewed tenant improvement allowances, and sent every term through separate attorneys. Juniper and Iron leased 4,100 square feet for 10 years. The rent was fair for the neighborhood. They received 5 months of rent abatement during construction and a $105,000 tenant improvement allowance. The lender, appraiser, and attorneys all knew Evan was my brother. Nothing was hidden from anyone financing the restaurant. Only our family did not know. Dad invested $135,000 in Evan's business. He called it backing proven talent. I said nothing. I had no problem with him helping Evan. What bothered me was how easily Dad forgot that he had once refused to lend me $25,000 with interest because I was supposedly too risky before signing the lease. Evan made one request: "Don't tell Dad you own the building until after we open." He said Dad would interfere with negotiations, question every decision, and tell everyone I had handed him a restaurant. I understood. Evan deserved to know whether his business could qualify on its own. So I agreed. At first, the secrecy protected both of us. Then it began protecting only him. When relatives asked how he found the location, Evan said he had spent months searching. That was true. When Dad praised him for transforming an abandoned warehouse, Evan accepted the compliment. That was not. The roof, electrical system, fire suppression, HVAC, windows, and accessibility work had been completed before Evan signed the lease. His team installed the kitchen, bar, furniture, and restaurant finishes. Both projects mattered. Only one was being acknowledged. During construction, Dad visited constantly. He ran his hands over the brick and admired the ventilation. "This is what building something looks like," he told Evan. Evan glanced at me, then changed the subject. Paige looked uncomfortable, but neither of them corrected him. On opening night, she asked me to bring the countersigned lease for the lender's final file. I placed it in my bag without imagining I would need it for anything else. Then, minutes before Dad's toast, I heard him tell an investor, "Evan is the first real entrepreneur in our family." My brother stood beside him. He knew who had bought the building, financed the restoration, and carried the risk before his first stove arrived. He still said nothing. I had agreed not to steal his spotlight. I had never agreed to let him build it by erasing me. By 7 o'clock, Juniper and Iron was full. The restored brick walls glowed beneath brass lights. Servers moved through the dining room with trays of champagne. The open kitchen flashed with heat and steel. Local business owners, investors, relatives, and members of the Chamber of Commerce filled every table. I was proud of Evan. He had spent years earning that room. When Dad stepped forward with his glass raised, I expected him to talk about the food truck, the late nights, and the risks Evan and Paige had taken. He did. Then he smiled at my brother. Evan finally built something real. The room applauded. Dad waited for the noise to settle, then turned toward me. So, Nora, when are you going to stop moving numbers around and do the same? A few people laughed. Mom looked down at her napkin. Paige looked at Evan. I lifted my water glass and took one slow sip. Then I looked directly at my brother. Do you want to answer that? His jaw tightened. He knew exactly what I was giving him one final chance to tell the truth himself. Not tonight. Nora. That answer made the decision for me. I reached into my bag, removed the folder Paige had asked me to bring, and placed the lease in front of Dad. Read the landlord's name. He adjusted his glasses. Foundry Row Properties. He glanced up. What is that supposed to mean? I turned to the signature page and pointed to the final line. Nora Bennett, managing member. Dad read it twice. Then he looked around the dining room as if the walls had changed. You own this space? The entire building, I said. The parking lot, too, and the 2 commercial suites upstairs. The room went silent. Evan set down his glass. Mom stared at me. Why didn't you tell us nobody asked? Dad's face hardened, searching for a way to make the information fit the story he had already told. Owning the walls is not the same as building the restaurant? No, I said. It isn't. I turned toward Evan and Paige. Evan created the menu, hired the kitchen, and built the brand. Paige built the front-of-house operation and the team that keeps it running. This restaurant is theirs. For a moment, Evan looked relieved. Then I pointed toward the ceiling. But the roof above us was replaced before they signed the lease. So were the electrical system, the fire suppression, the HVAC, the windows, and the accessibility work. Dad said nothing. $325,000 in renovations made this building usable before the first stove arrived. Celeste, standing near the bar, spoke up. The lease was independently negotiated. She said, the rent, improvement allowance, and family relationship were all disclosed to the lender. Dad looked at Evan. You knew Evan did not answer quickly enough. That hesitation said everything. Dad turned back to me. So this was some kind of sweetheart deal, no? It was a market lease reviewed by attorneys, a broker, an appraiser, and the bank. I kept my voice level. You asked when I would build something real while standing inside the answer. No one laughed this time, but Dad was not ready to let go of the comparison. He looked at Evan and said, Your brother still risked everything to make this happen. That was when I realized he was about to defend one final lie. The $135,000 he had quietly invested in Evan's dream. Dad's defense landed harder than the toast. Evan risked everything, he said. That is what makes this different. I looked at him. Everything except the $135,000 you invested. The silence deepened. 2 investors near the bar exchanged a glance. Mom closed her eyes. A few relatives looked at Evan as if they were recalculating the story they had just applauded. Evan's face tightened. That was an investment, not a gift. I know, I said. I never called it a gift. Dad stepped closer. Then why bring it up? Because you keep calling him self-made while using him to prove I never built anything. I reminded Dad of the duplex I had tried to buy 8 years earlier. I had asked him for a $25,000 loan, with interest, a repayment schedule, and a signed promissory note. He had refused before reading the plan. You called me a bad investment. That was different. Why he had no answer that did not expose the difference between us. I continued before anger could take over my voice. Helping Evan was never wrong. Pretending he did everything alone so you could compare him to me was... Dad said I had hidden my success from the family. You never told us you owned properties worth this much. You never asked. You sent me articles about starter homes and stable jobs because you preferred your assumptions. Mom finally spoke. She should not have needed a lease to make you listen. Dad stared at her, shocked that she had stepped out of her usual role as peacemaker. Evan motioned toward the private dining room. Nora, now. Inside. He shut the door behind us. You turned my opening night into a public accounting of my finances. I celebrated your restaurant all evening. You exposed Dad's investment after he said you risked everything. Evan paced once across the room. You promised to keep the ownership private. I promised not to take credit for your restaurant. I never promised to let you use my silence against me. I did not say anything. That was the problem. He told me he had only wanted one night without our family turning everything into a competition. You had that chance, I said. Dad asked when I would build something real. I looked at you. You told me. Not tonight. I did not want a scene. Silence was the scene you chose. Outside the door. Silverware clinked as the celebration tried to recover. Paige entered quietly. She is right, she said. Evan turned toward her. Paige admitted that he had started enjoying the self-made version of the story. He had corrected lenders, lawyers, and vendors because he had to. He had not corrected relatives because he liked what they believed. Evan's anger faded into embarrassment. If people know my sister owns the building, they will think you gave me this restaurant. The lease is at market rate. Your company qualified for its loan. You created the menu, hired the staff, and built the brand. None of that disappears because I restored the property. I paused. But my work does not disappear to protect yours either. Then I set the boundaries. The lease would remain unchanged. There would be no rent increase, eviction threat, or retaliation. From then on, every property request would go through the manager. No informal extensions, no family pressure, no undocumented favors, and I would not guarantee any expansion loan. Evan nodded slowly. I left before dessert, while the restaurant remained open and the guests returned to celebrating him. I did not take my brother's restaurant away. I only took back the part of my story he had been willing to erase. For the next 3 months, Juniper and Iron stayed open. The restaurant did not collapse because of one ugly family night. It struggled for ordinary reasons. Food costs ran higher than Evan expected. 2 servers quit in the same week. The original menu was too large, and the kitchen could not execute every dish consistently during peak hours. Paige cut the menu. Evan changed suppliers, rebuilt the schedule, and started spending less time defending his image and more time studying the numbers. I did not rescue them beyond the lease we had already signed. Property questions went through the manager. Repair requests were documented. Rent was paid according to the agreement. There were no late-night calls asking me to be a sister instead of a landlord. Dad did not apologize immediately. His first message said I had embarrassed him in front of investors and relatives. I answered once. You were embarrassed by the truth after using an assumption to embarrass me. Mom stopped carrying messages between us. You need to talk to your daughter yourself, she told him. I am done translating what you meant. 2 months later, a local business magazine interviewed Evan about the restaurant. He sent me the article without comment. Near the end, he had said, my sister restored the building and gave this business a place to exist. We built the restaurant. But she created the opportunity. It was not a dramatic apology. It was better. It was public correction without asking me to comfort him afterward. Paige continued running the front of house, and our relationship became simpler once business stayed in writing. Dad came to one of my other properties in early spring. It was a smaller former print shop I planned to convert into 3 office suites. For the first time, he did not tell me what I should have done. He asked about the purchase price, financing, renovation reserve, tenant demand, and what would happen if leasing took longer than expected. I answered every question. When we finished walking the building, he stood near the old loading door. I did not understand what you built, he said. You did not try to. He nodded instead of arguing. That mattered more than a perfect apology. By the end of the year, Juniper and Iron was profitable, both upstairs suites were leased, and a bakery had taken the remaining retail bay. The property appraised at roughly $1,480,000. Recognition did not create my success. It only arrived late enough for my family to realize how long they had been standing beside it, a year after the grand opening. Juniper and Iron hosted an anniversary dinner. The restaurant was full, the upstairs offices were leased, and the bakery next door had sold out. Dad raised his glass. For 1 second, I braced for another comparison. Instead, he said, Evan built a restaurant people want to return to. Paige built the team that keeps it running. Nora built the place that gave both of them room. No one was ranked above anyone else. Evan lifted his glass toward me. I looked around at the restored brick, the dining room, and the building Dad once said deserved a wrecking ball. My success had always been real. It simply had not looked familiar to him. My father thought achievement belonged to the person whose name was over the door. He never thought to ask who owned the walls. He asked when I would build something real while standing inside it. Would you have revealed the lease that night or waited until the party ended? Comment below and subscribe for more family betrayal and clean revenge stories.